Hey, you guys, welcome to this week's episode of the Pantry Chat Food for Thought. This week, we are talking about sourdough. And I am so excited to get to have Lisa Bass from Farmhouse on Boone with me today because you guys all know her. I could do the like official bio intro, but you guys, I'm sure all know her. If you don't, go check her out on Farmhouse on Boone. But what I'm so excited about is Lisa is just getting ready to release a brand new book all on sourdough called Daily Sourdough. So Lisa, thank you so much for coming over and joining us. I'm excited to get to talk today about common sourdough misconceptions and mistakes.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
I love this topic because when I first started making bread, I initially dreamed about making sourdough, but I was instantly overwhelmed starting to read about it. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is so complicated. And so I kind of regrouped and I ended up going to yeast bread making, and I made yeast bread for years. Just saying, no, I can't make sourdough really work for my life. It doesn't really fit. There's too much going on. And so I was really scared of it for a long time until I started diving in. And now I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm so thankful for sourdough because it's so forgiving and allows me so much more flexibility in life. But a lot of people, I think, feel that overwhelm at the beginning.
Yeah, it's to me, because every once in a while I'll make something with yeast. And to me now, sourdough is so much easier. I was talking to somebody recently and they were like, so overwhelmed with sourdough. I really want to make it, but all the things that you just said. And I asked her, I'm like, do you make yeast bread? She's like, oh yeah, I do that. I'm like, just literally take that recipe and the exact process you do and just put in a half a cup of starter instead of yeast, let it rise a little bit longer, but do everything else the exact same. She's like, oh, I'm like, yeah, I don't know why whenever it's sourdough, all of a sudden it's like this mysterious thing, but it's just yeast, different yeast.
It really is. And it's much more forgiving, I think, than regular yeast is because, you get in the middle of a project and you're like, oh, I can't finish this right now. So you throw it in the refrigerator and slow down the fermentation and you come back to it later. Whereas regular yeast, by the time you got to it later, you would have totally played it out. It would have been tired and not rise anymore. So I feel like it is actually so much more flexible and it really becomes this like tool that we have in the kitchen.
Yeah, it's so weird. It's such a misunderstanding that sourdough is going to be this thing that takes over your life when, like you just said, I feel the exact opposite with it. Like I never think, okay, should I start sourdough now? Because if I start it now, then it'll be here and then it doesn't cross my mind. I just start sourdough anytime I want to start it. And then at some point it's like, oh, it's bedtime. Either, I throw it in the fridge or we just keep going with it. Like there's always a way to make it work.
Life is so busy. We need every single bit of practicality and like every weapon that we can pull for making all this come together. And that for me is one of them. In our house, we've now gone to where we make this giant batch of sourdough dough once a week. And then we just like scoop out what we need half the time, and get it rising. I could never do that the way I do, with sourdough. I could never do that with yeast. And it's just such a blessing to have such fresh bread whenever you want it and healthy on top of it.
There's just like, whenever it's sourdough, people start measuring things by the gram. They start saying words like stretch and fold instead of kneading. And it just sounds like this whole other beast, but actually, yeah, it's just so flexible and easy, really.
Do you weigh in your own house?
So there's certain recipes that it's easier because it all just goes in one bowl because I just, instead of like getting out a bunch of cup measures, it's actually easier to weigh. But at first that somehow overwhelmed me. So I guess I just say that for people who are like, yeah, but I have to have a scale and like, it's all different. Then just use cups and do your usual recipe. But at some point you might find it's actually easier for certain things. Now, certain things I still just use cups and I think it's, super.
Do you weigh when you feed your sourdough?
Never have. Neither will.
See, I can handle weighing a recipe because I'm there to cook. I'm already thinking that. It's that the measurements, it's the feedings, like day and night, and whenever you're doing the feedings, that I'm like, I'm not going to get out.
No, why would you have to? That would overcomplicate it to a point of making it not any better. Like I'm for, like we were talking about freeze drying on my podcast earlier today. like there is some precision there that actually ends up with a better result when you pay attention to a few things here and there. Sourdough is like, at least for feeding the starter, and honestly recipes too, I'm sure people would argue with me, you don't end up with a better result. So why would you take the time?
Well, for me, it was so freeing when I was reading the kids, one of the Little House on the Prairie books, and I realized Ma is actually taking the dough that she was using left over from the biscuits to feed her sourdough starter. And I was like, she's just dumping in scraps.
Yeah.
Like if she can just dump in scraps and make it work, I can put a little flour and water in and make it okay.
Yes,
so
absolutely.
Okay, cool. Well, we're going to really break through some of those misconceptions today and free up a lot of people from their, like, the things that are holding them back when it comes to sourdough. But before we jump into that, tell us about, like, how did you get started with baking sourdough? Because you have a lot of sourdough information on your on your website. So I'm so excited that you're writing this book, because you seem like the person that I want to learn from on this. So this is great. But how did you get started in the first place?
Well, I read Nourishing Traditions way back in, I want to say 2010. My second daughter was a baby, and it seemed like the way to make grains more digestible was to ferment them in some way. So first I started doing like the yogurt or apple cider vinegar, a little bit of that with your grains. I made pancakes that way. I made bread that way. But then I learned about sourdough. I'm like, that sounds a little bit more straightforward, because it's not an extra step. It's just part of the bread making process. And I started my starter, I believe, around 2011. I'm always saying, like, was it 2010, 2011? I don't know. It's been alive that long, though, for whatever, 13, 14 years now. I just was doing it for the gut health benefits of it. So I didn't know about all of the fancy things people do today. Like, I did not have a little scoring knife. I didn't have Banneton baskets. I didn't have a scale. I was doing what I told that lady the other day to do, and taking the bread I'd already learned how to make, because I was already familiar with making yeast bread. I really got into that when I first got married and had my first baby. So I just kind of took what I knew about that and then just swapped the yeast out. And I think that's because of my background with, like, oh, we soak the grains. I'm like, okay, well then now I have this sourdough to soak the grains. So because that didn't translate to me that it was something other, like it wasn't something different. And I just did it like that for the longest time. And I only did whole grains. And now, like, I, just like everybody else during 2020, you know, there was like a surge of, oh, we're going to decorate our breads with these beautiful scoring patterns. And if you put it in the Banneton basket and you weigh everything and you use a cast iron Dutch oven, I just before used stainless steel loaf pans. Like I said, I took my recipe and just put sourdough in it. And that's how I baked with it for, 10 years before changing that. Maybe not 10 years, probably like 7. My math could be a little off here.
That's great. What are some of the biggest mistakes you think you made at the beginning? Or did you make it? Did it just work? And it just was like, oh, that was easy.
I definitely didn't have like the bakery style creations that I have in my kitchen today. It was edible. It was sustenance, but it was rustic, and it wasn't like now the bread I make, if I use all-purpose flour and I follow all the rules, which I love doing, but it isn't the healthiest thing in the world. I usually will try to do like half whole grain, half all purpose. That way I still get that, that taste and those big airy holes. Now I think my bread tastes way, way, way better than store-bought bread. But at that time I'd say, like, I got it done. Like, I got it on the table. It was all like whole grain and dense, but we were eating it. And I also used a lot of sourdough to make like pancakes and waffles and English muffins. I don't know that I would call that a mistake, but it probably just wasn't like as good as it could have been.
Yeah, kind of learning through the process of what's better and what tastes better. And I know for us, even for my family, there's a journey going from like all white flour into the whole grain. And then you kind of get to a point, I don't know about you, but for me, we were very idealist at the beginning, and we were trying to go with all like freshly ground whole wheat. And then at some point you're like, everybody's begging me for the store-bought stuff because it's white flour.
Yep.
And so you start kind of going, okay, is there a balance? What's the balance between making sure everybody's happy and healthy, and it tastes good, but it's good for you, and kind of trying to find that middle ground in your path through it.
Yeah, I definitely started idealistic like that too. So I only ever used all whole grain. I mean, there's so many areas of my early motherhood and marriage that was like very perfectionist. But then your kids get a little older and you're like, they're a little bit more resilient than I thought they were. Like, I'm not going to ruin you with one loaf of all purpose bread, but you're still controlling those quality ingredients. And I've really settled on half whole grain, half all purpose in most of my recipes, a high quality all purpose, of course.
Yeah.
Organic, unbleached, all that, really tasting just as good or better than, like, way better than store-bought, but like almost as even as good as an all-purpose entire thing. So that's been our little balance.
That's great. Okay, so today we are going to be diving into the different misconceptions that people have about sourdough. And the first one we've already kind of touched on a little bit, but I think it's really worth making a point about because this was me. I really believed this when I first read it. And that is that making sourdough is hard and high maintenance.
Mm-hmm.
Is that true? Or is that a misconception?
No, it is so not true. I think it's like anything, when you get really familiar with something and you, instead of like thinking you need to follow everything to a T, but you can just see that it's right, it's so easy. And people also really think it's wasteful, which we probably should, I'm probably skipping ahead, but people think that you have to discard all the time just because when you first start a starter, you do that. But actually you don't. There's always something you can make with it. It is definitely not high maintenance. I used to also, I will say one thing, I learned to always knead dough when I first started making bread, and I had a big Bosch mixer with a big dough hook. And through sourdough, I learned that if you let pretty much any dough sit for a little while and then just kind of stretch it and fold it, it's like you don't have to go through this huge process where you're kneading. And sourdough kind of taught me that, but that even works with regular bread as well. And it's just so much easier than even bread that I made before.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I love that about not even doing the kneading. You can kind of either knead it or you can take the time. That makes me think of like sauerkraut. It's the same thing with sauerkraut. You can sit there and you can bash the sauerkraut, pound the sauerkraut.
Yes, or just let it sit in the bowl with salt.
Or you can just let it sit there overnight and let it do its thing. It's like, exactly. Come back the next morning and it's all done. I'm like, I know which one I'm going to choose personally. So I love that, those places where you find just these efficiencies.
Yeah, I'd say it fits into your life better because I really didn't think about when I said, oh, that would work with regular bread because I'd never make yeast bread anymore. But I guess maybe it would start to ferment, or like the instant yeast would act on it too quickly while you're waiting. So maybe it wouldn't work. So sourdough is way easier because you put it in the bowl, you mix it up, then you walk away for like an hour, and then every once in a while you come over and you kind of stretch it. And it's that forgiving. So you spend like next to no time working the dough.
Well, you totally called it out too, to say that there's almost this different language that happens, this different vocabulary around sourdough, which makes us feel like it's way harder, way more high maintenance than just a regular dough. Mm-hmm. And that stretch and fold is one of those, because it's like, oh my gosh, I gotta come back every 15 minutes or every half hour or whatever the recipe says. Yeah. And it's like, I can't pay that much attention to my bread dough,
Yeah.
But just like you're saying, it's a really flexible. Do you find that you like have to watch the clock?
No, never. And it's tricky because as a blogger, and you know this, I have to give very specific instructions on how to do something, or people are like, they freak out, because they're brand new and they need to know, like, how do I do this? And so I can tell you the way that I really do it, which is typically what I show on YouTube. And then on the blog, I kind of spell it out like every 20 minutes, just because you need times, And in the book, I'm like that too, because people are starting and they want to know. But yeah, any recipe that doesn't really, it kind of translates to almost all sourdough recipes, depending on the hydration. But you let it sit for a while. I mean, you can walk away for, like last night, I mixed up some dough. Didn't really, I never think like, oh, what are our plans? Do I have time for sourdough? I just mix up dough when I think about it. And then Luke's like, hey, let's go down and go on a walk. We went on a family walk for, I don't know, probably an hour and a half. So you're supposed to let the dough sit to hydrate with the water and the starter for, I think, 30 minutes technically. So we came back an hour and a half later. I did a stretch and a fold. Maybe we made dinner and cleaned up. At some point, I was like, oh, stretch and fold, which basically just means pull the dough up and slap it back down. It's not a big, there's no technique to that. I know people will say like, hey, quarter turn, stretch, make sure you've gone up a foot, fold it back. There's no technique. You just literally just kind of like slap it around. And then there's no timing. Like I just throughout the evening, and then before bed, it was cool enough in our house to leave it out overnight. And then I'm baking it now because I put it in the Banningtons in the fridge this day. But you could also leave it out, and I could have baked it this morning. Like it's just so flexible.
Would it ruin it if you didn't do any of the stretch and folds? Like you got sidetracked and you just walked away?
Probably not. I've never actually done that, but I will say that the longer you let it sit, the flour, the water, the starter, and the salt, it's already stretchy. So I'm pretty sure, like, I don't know what's happening there. Like I started thinking, why did I used to always knead? Because it seems like if it just sits there, I mean, I don't know. Have you tried that? I've never tried doing any stretch and fold. I've tried like 2 or 3.
Yeah, I have, because I've forgot that I have a tendency
like
to
like start and walked away. Okay.
Totally forgot. I've done that even pressure canning, like turned it on, walked away and forgotten. That's how I know pressure canners don't blow up anymore, you know? But yeah, and it's just kind of, it's probably not as light and airy as it would be if you did it, but it's still completely edible, and I've never had anybody complain about it. So yeah.
Yeah. Totally. I mean, I've definitely done like one of my recipes calls for 6 stretch and folds, and another one calls for 3 because it's the easy version. I mean, in reality, I don't count. I just kind of do it a few times. And if I fit in 3 before bedtime, that's probably what it's going to be. If I start the dough at say 2 in the afternoon because it's cooler in the kitchen, I can leave it out all night, it's probably getting 6, or I'm going to stash it in the fridge before bed if it's hot. Like it's just so flexible.
You're not really like looking at your recipes and going, exactly what's the timing on these stretch and folds?
No way, never. Not on anything. Yeah, not on rolls, not on pizza, not on bread, nothing.
Okay, so you guys can all just take a deep breath, relax. It's way more flexible. It's sourdough. It's a living thing that's not a commercialized product. Your yeast, you have to work on special times, especially if you're working with something like an instant yeast, an active yeast. You've got to really keep your times a little more careful because it's doing something on a specific timeline. It's bred that way, or laboratory created that way, or whatever it is that they do to it. But your sourdough starter is working at the pace of life because it's a living bacteria and yeast that you've got around you. It is actually going to kind of conform to your kitchen, which is beautiful. It's a lovely thing. It's something we love. So take a deep breath. You can relax. It's okay. Okay, let's move on to misconception number 2. I'm actually going to throw a couple of them together here because this one is your starter must be really mature before baking. Like it has to be kind of old, like come from somebody else. You see these starters that are like 150 years old from San Francisco. Or it needs to pass tests. There's a whole bunch of tests out there that you can use before you can bake with it.
Yeah, I get this question all the time. And I actually have a funny story about it because I've always bragged about my starter that's, by COVID time, I'm like, my starter's already almost a decade old. You guys are just starting one. And then I made this sourdough course. And as part of the course, I had to show how to start a starter. And I hadn't done it in a decade or whatever. And so I started a brand new starter, and then I was going to do this cool side-by-side comparison where I showed them the bread made with my old starter and the bread made with my new starter and how better it was. And my new starter bread was better. And it was only 7 days old. And I was like, do I have to include this in the course? Because it like genuinely, I don't really know, probably because the fresh flour, and then my kitchen must be exceptionally yeasty because I bake so much, but in 7 days, I definitely had a better loaf of bread, a better boule with my new starter. That was kind of thrown. And somebody actually told me years ago on a YouTube video, they were like, it doesn't actually get better. Like it only gets better for like so long. And then once it's mature, it's mature. And it doesn't continue to age beyond like however many weeks or months. And I mean, I kind of saw that firsthand with my little experiment. And then there's also the float test, which I never knew about until COVID. Like I said, it was like this thing I did was very intuitive. It was no problem at all. And then COVID came out and it was like, okay, this is serious. Like we got to figure this whole thing out. And there's a float test. And I'm like, I don't even know if mine passes it. And I've been making bread for however many years now. So I think, yeah, it kind of blows those misconceptions.
Oh yeah, it definitely does. And, for anybody listening, Lisa's kitchen is obviously, like she said, very yeasty because it doesn't work that way for everybody. Some people, they're going on a month and they're still trying to get their bread to do something, besides like sit there. And for some people, it's, it's really fast. I've seen it go both directions. I think it has a lot to do with your kitchen and how clean or sterile it is. Like, if
mine's
you
not
have
clean or sterile.
right, exactly. If you have brand new construction, though, you're living in a place with like all brand new construction. It hasn't taken on a bunch of good yeasts and it's still like off gassing or whatever is going on that's keeping it very, very clean. You might not have that result. And I think it's really different in different places too. There's not really an equation for like when it's perfectly ready. And I think that might be why there's things like the float test out there, but that doesn't mean that you can't bake with your sourdough just because it doesn't test, pass some arbitrary test.
And what's the worst that can happen? So people ask me, they'll be like, send me an email. You're like, okay, so am I ready? And I'm like, the only way to know is if you try it. If you do end up with something that you don't feel is edible, like it's a brick, it's really dense, you can make lots of things with it. One of my favorites is sourdough breadcrumbs. So we cut it up, toast it in the oven, put it in the blender, and then we put our favorite's fried chicken. So we dip chicken, in eggs and then breadcrumbs and then fry it in pork lard. And it is so good. I take perfectly good sourdough loaves and turn them into sourdough breadcrumbs because that's how good they are. So any quality of bread can become that. So if your starter's not ready, then just try it. And the worst that can happen is you have some delicious breadcrumbs for meatloaf, pasta dishes, all that stuff.
I love it. Yeah. I love that question. I think that's something that's so good to come back to all the time is like, what's the worst that could happen?
Yeah.
Well, the worst that can happen is it doesn't rise very much and you do something else with it.
Yes, exactly. This is not that consequential. Like if you bake with an immature starter, you're not going to wait. Like if you're worried about wasting it, that's not going to happen. I think most people with questions like this are worried about wasting their time. But it's really anytime that you try something, you aren't wasting your time because you're learning something about it. I mean, you and I probably both, I'm like hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of loaves in. So, of course, and there's been bad, there's been good, but you're learning something from each one.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And sometimes it's that experience is just a teacher that you cannot bypass. It doesn't matter how many books you read, how many YouTube videos you watch, getting your hands in there and actually doing it is something that is going to teach you more than all the time you can spend problem solving the what ifs. So that's good.
Absolutely.
Just go do it. Okay. Next misconception. Where your starter comes from determines the flavor of your bread. Is this a misconception or is this true?
Honestly, I don't really know. I've definitely heard it's true, but I'm wondering if it's a misconception because I've only ever tried my Missouri sourdough starter. I mean, I've tried other people's bread, but I don't know if I'm like a nuanced taste tester type of person enough to be like, I don't know. I don't know if it's true. Is it true?
I don't have an answer for this one either, but I always figure because you're continuing to feed your sourdough with your flour in your kitchen, maybe it starts off like you get that packet of you see the Klondike or the San Francisco are kind of the ones that you see all over the place, right? And so maybe right away when you rehydrate it, it still has some of the original bacteria and yeast, but I think it has to change if it's in your kitchen eventually. So it probably all comes back to your kitchen sourdough starter. That's my theory.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I've definitely heard it. I think it would take somebody who's has a distinguished palate probably to detect, but maybe not.
How many sourdough starters have you ever had going at once? Do you just have your one or have you actually done more than one at a time?
Just my one. Like when I started that second one, I think I just at the end of it just poured it into my other one and had a conglomeration. But no, I only ever do one.
That's very practical. Stick with one. Don't do a bunch. They're a pain. Don't do it that way. That is maintenance. That's high maintenance. If you're all trying to feed the right flour. And I know I have some friends who are really into sourdough, and they will actually keep very different ones, one of which is a chocolate sourdough, which you actually feed with some amount of chocolate powder, which is fascinating to me. But I've never tasted it.
That'd be an occasion where I would keep a separate jar. But like any other thing, like I'll throw rye flour in, einkorn in, whole grain wheat, all purpose. I mean, mine's been fed with everything possible over the years. Cocoa, I could see being a bit of a different thing.
Yeah, definitely. So you do the mutt flour in your jar or your sourdough, just whatever there is in the kitchen.
Yep, whatever there is.
I love it. Okay. Here's another one. Tell us if this one's true or not. You have to use a filtered or distilled water to feed your sourdough starter.
The first like 8-ish, 9-ish years that I had a starter, I was in town and I used a Berkey filter. And then here we started using the Berkey. And then after a while, you get kind of tired of it and you're like, how bad could it be? And so we've been strictly on just how our water comes out of the well for the last 3-4 years probably. And it's thrives still. So I think the only thing you'd want to make sure isn't in there is like chlorine. Like if you're on county or public water of any kind, probably yes, you should filter it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Chlorine we know is stuck in there to, and fluoride to clean it.
Yes.
So that you don't have living things in your water. And if you're trying to grow living things, then you don't want to stick that.
Yes, that's a problem for sure. Yes.
So it really depends on your water supply is what you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely.
Discarding part of your starter is a waste of money.
Well, so you always save it. You never discard anything. And the only reason you ever discard is when you're starting your starter, because with doubling things, every single day. Have you ever heard that thing where if you double a penny, you'll end up with like $1 million or something like that? Well, if you double starter for like 10 days or however long you're starting your starter, you always have to feed the yeast that's in it with as much or more than was in there before. So if you have, you start with a cup, then you have 2 cups, and you have 4, you have to discard during that process and put it in a separate jar, or you'll be wasting more because you'd be feeding it like exponential amounts by like day 5. So you discard it in order to not waste, but you put it in a separate jar. That way you can build up this good jar here on the counter, and you put it in a separate jar. And then, once you have enough, you make discard pancakes or tortillas. Or there's like thousands of discard recipes over on my blog, not thousands, but in the world, there are thousands, and I have several on mine as well. But don't ever actually discard. That just means put it in a separate jar so that your little master jar, if you will, won't get, fill up your whole house.
That's one of the sourdough terminologies I wish we could change, because I think it's so misleading. Yeah. It's just it's just use it differently. Take it out of your mother jar. Yeah. I love it.
Yeah, your mother jar would have to be like your whole house if you didn't, but yes.
Yeah, because it does add up really quickly. Even if you start with 1 tablespoon as your like some tiny amount, if you keep doubling that, it does not take very many feedings before you're like, I can't eat this many pancakes. Like, yes, I don't need this much.
Yeah, and so as long as you put it in a separate jar, you won't have that exponential growth, and then just make pancakes with it.
Okay, next misconception. Sourdough is always sour.
So there are lots of things you can do to manipulate the flavor of bread. You can use different flours. Like an all-purpose is usually less sour than a whole grain, a freshly milled flour. If you keep something on the longer that the starter and the flour and the water interact with each other, the more sour it gets. So if you do like a really long fridge rise, that'll make it more sour. Whereas like I have this recipe on the blog for a same day sourdough bread, and it's in the book as well, obviously, where, in the morning, you can take your starter right out of the fridge as long as it was active at some point, feed it, and then just let it go, like do some stretch and folds. At some point, like maybe like only 4 or 5 hours in, shape it, let it sit out in the Banana tin, no fridge rise at all, and then bake it that night. That's going to be a much less sour sourdough. So it really just depends on the temperature and then how long they're having that chance to interact with each other.
Yeah. So you actually have a lot of control over the sourness of your sourdough.
You really do. Like you can use a very active starter that will start to work really quickly. You can use a starter that's kind of been in the fridge and it's a little bit, it's sleepy, and manipulate it that way. And you really can just experiment with what gives you the best flavor. And then it'll change seasonally too. Like we're moving into, fall and the colder months. And so the way I do my sourdough is a lot different than what I was doing a few months ago.
Because you are adjusting for the temperature changes in your kitchen?
Yes. Like I couldn't a couple of months ago stretch and fold and leave it to do that bulk ferment in the pantry for, while overnight, like while I was in bed. But now I can do that again, and it'll develop more of a sour flavor because I'm letting it do much longer. It's not like this really fast process. Whereas like in the summer, I can get bread from morning to afternoon just about, because everything's just really ramped up with the temperature.
So for those of you guys who are listening and that kind of concept of something that's changing in a life starts to make you nervous, you're actually already really familiar with it. If you think about like how you treat food, let's say at a picnic, a potluck, when it's hot outside, you're going to treat that a little bit different than when it's cold outside, right? You're going to be like, we have a very short period of time to eat this food and get it back into refrigeration before we start worrying about the mayonnaise not being good anymore, right?
Right. Yes.
But if you're, wintertime and it's cold out, you have a much longer time. And it's the exact same theory going on here, is that bacteria, those yeast, they breed faster when it's warmer. And so they're kind of doing their thing, and they're multiplying more, and they're putting off more of their acids and all of that as it's warmer. When you slow that down a little bit, it's not rising as fast. It's not multiplying as fast. It's not putting off the gases as fast that give you the nice air pockets. It's still doing it, but it slows down the process. So, I think this is one of these things, is like when we're learning a new skill like sourdough, we maybe don't have the knowledge to like attach it to other bits of skills, right? We're forming all new synapses. But if you can find the places where you're like, no, actually, this already works like something that I know about, it helps you to like grasp mentally what you're learning, I feel like. So
I think that's a really good
new concept. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That's a really good point, because like you said, like you would intuitively know, okay, there's bacteria that's growing, and so I should get this into the refrigerator, where you're like, oh, it's cold outside, we can just leave that, sit in the car all night. Right. That's a really good way to translate that over.
It goes into fermentation too, which is another thing you teach a lot about. It's kind of the same thing starts applying over there, because it's all working with like, how fast is the bacteria growing? Like kind of all correlates to one thing to the next. Oh, here's one that I run into all the time. Sourdough bread always has a hard, crusty exterior that's hard to chew.
Okay, so this, I think, is a preference thing that happens over time, because now, like, there's recipes. I have a recipe in my book and on the blog for a sandwich loaf, which is not like that, because I literally just take basically like a recipe you're used to making sandwich bread with. If you've made, yeast sandwich bread that has something like a fat, like a butter or an oil in it, or a sweetener like sugar or honey, and it's soft, and you don't put it in a Dutch oven, and you don't preheat the Dutch oven, you just shape it and put it into a regular loaf pan, let it double and bake it. It's not gonna be any different because it's sourdough. It's just the way that you do it. So what you're thinking of is the way that people traditionally do sourdough, which is no enriched, no fat, no sugar, no honey. And then like just flour, water, salt, and starter, and then putting it in a preheated Dutch oven is what creates that crusty crust. But what's funny is when I first got into it, I thought, oh, I don't want that kind. I just want like my regular sandwich loaf. But then now that I'm so used to making bread, I'm like, why would you want that? It's just so much more delicious. I mean, do you feel that way? People are like, oh, but I want soft sandwich bread. Like that's what we want. I'm like, I think that's just because that's what you're used to, because that sourdough is so good.
Yeah, I kind of agree. You get to really liking that chewy bit, although it makes me nervous when the kids are slicing it. That's the one place where I'm like, if they have to cut it, I want it a little bit softer, because it is hard to cut, especially when it's hot out of the oven.
Yes. Oh my goodness. But yeah, you can do like I have a brioche that has eggs. It has butter. I mean, it's like loaded, and it is the softest,
Ooh.
like it's softer than, like a store-bought slice. So you can, again, it's just the yeast. Like it's not like a whole different thing. So you can make crusty yeast breads and you can make soft yeast breads. It's about what you add and how you bake them. So just because it's sourdough doesn't mean that you can't manipulate it in that exact same way. It's just a matter of like what you add to the dough and how you prepare it.
Oh, yeah, totally. That's great. Hopefully everybody's walking away right now with this sense that sourdough is really flexible, because that it's very flexible, it's very forgiving, it's very healthy, but ultimately it's very flexible and very practical because it is so flexible. And so if there's no other takeaway, I hope it's that like, don't worry, it's okay.
What works for your family? Like if you're used to a big like Pullman style, loaf of bread, there's a sourdough version of that. Like there's a sourdough version of whatever you're used to, whatever you or your kids are comfortable with, what you have sandwiches on, whatever. Yeah.
One more here. Um, and this one, I hear this a lot also. This is that your sourdough starter should never touch, and then there's a whole list. Like metal is
Okay.
one I hear all the
Oh
time.
yeah, yeah.
Silicone, some people say. Plastic, some people say. What do you think about that?
I mean, I definitely use metal spoons in mine because I just grab whatever's the nearest one. And wood spoons are kind of harder to clean, I think. And so typically I'll just reach for a metal spoon. So that clearly doesn't matter. I haven't stored my starter long term in anything plastic. So I can't really speak to, I wouldn't probably for the other reasons like,
Right.
microplastics and all that. But I don't think it would really mess it up. And what else can it not touch? I probably have broken every rule and it's been just fine. They're really resilient.
Yeah, I kind of wonder sometimes where the rules start too, like who decided that? And I don't know that it was the sourdough that actually decided those
Yeah,
rules.
no, I don't think it was a sourdough.
I think it was a person. Is there anything that they shouldn't touch? Like, I know like some of the reactive metals, copper, aluminum.
I don't really know. I will say that I store mine in glass and I'll stir it with whatever spoon I have. But I've even like I leave things to long ferment in my stainless steel mixer regularly, and so that seems to be fine because it still bubbles over. It's all good.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, probably just the things like you typically wouldn't want to use anyways in your kitchen, like things that wouldn't be healthy otherwise. I would think it would apply.
I know. I try to get away more and more from plastic everywhere that I can,
Yeah.
especially the flexible plastics, anything that's going to degrade really quickly. And
Yes.
then, I mean, probably like an uncoated cast iron. Eventually, it's going to start messing up your cast iron just because of the acidity in it. Yeah,
Yeah.
probably same thing with like copper and aluminum. It might start leaching a little bit, but as to whether that would actually harm the sourdough starter, I'm not sure.
Well, and you can bake in anything. I mean, I'm thinking people if the only thing that would be like a long-term thing would be the actual starter that you're keeping, like your master mother starter. And so
Right.
just keep that in glass. But I mean, you're only exposing, if that is a problem, you're only exposing it to metal like so much, and then you're only baking in those other materials. I wouldn't think anybody's like keeping their starter in a, aluminum. And if you are, just don't, just move it to glass. You can use a mason jar.
I mean, mason jars are good for everything, really.
Yes.
I just use them for everything that there is. So,
Right.
Awesome. Well, I am so excited about your book to come out. I can't wait to get to hold it and get to see it. And I am definitely going to be baking the recipes in there, but I will be doing them loosely the way you
very
want them,
loosely.
I'm sure.
Yes,
Because
I
I
just look at
can't.
the amounts and then the rest, I'm like, I just know.
Oh man, I totally understand that. People always want recipes, and I'm like, I don't actually have one. I just throw some things into a bowl and mix it together.
That's where blogging and book writing is a bit of a challenge.
That's good, but it's going to be awesome. I'm so excited for that. Thank you so much for coming on and chatting about sourdough with us. You guys, if you haven't checked out Lisa before, make sure you jump on over to Farmhouse on Boone. And I think it's just FarmhouseonBooneand.com.
Yep.
Check out our recipes there. But is it on pre-order? Is your book on pre-order at this point?
Yeah, actually, I think like by the time this comes out, it should be like all the way out.
Oh, okay. So make sure you jump over and you either pre-order or you purchase a copy of her book. What's the best place to do that, Lisa?
Homesteadliving.com, and then it's just in the shop, or you can do /daily-sourdough. But homesteadliving.com.
All right. Awesome. Okay. Well, thank you so much. And we'll see you guys all soon.
Thank you.
Bye.